All right, so welcome to chapter 7. So we're going to be talking about the axial skeleton, and we're also going to kind of put chapter 7 and 8 together because really they're both just talking about our skeleton. Okay, so kind of to get started here, so we're going to talk about our bones because it's really important that you guys know the different names of your bones, reinforce some of the stuff you're learning in lab. You'll be going into some allied health field, and even if you're not, even if you decide to go on to something else, this is talking about your body, and it's very often that we break something or someone we know does. So this will allow you to better understand medical terminology, what's being said to you, what's going on, and also better ask questions. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna hide my image here. So here's a quick little view. It's a nice little diagram of axial versus appendicular skeletons. So anything you see in that light blue, that's axial skeleton. And then anything you see in sort of that beige is your appendicular skeleton. Okay, so and you can see on the slide what's included in both. You don't necessarily need to worry about these bone numbers. That's just there to give you an idea of how many things we're talking about. Right? We talk about our skeletons. We have 5 basic types of bones. We have long bones, and those are long bones. They're ones that are sort of best characterized as short, because they're short. Others are called flat bones, because they're flat. I think you're kind of getting the idea of how this works. Some are irregular bones, because there's really no other way to describe them. They're kind of like a weird shape to them, so they're irregular, kind of like a vertebral bone. And then we have what are known as sesamoid bones. So sesamoid bones tend to be sort of round-shaped floater bones, and usually they're going to be found in joints. So the largest sesamoid bone in your body is your patella or your kneecap. And we'll see some of these in a second. There's also what are known as sutural bones. So you saw the sutures of the skull in lab. Sometimes the way the sutures fuse in some people, you actually end up with an extra bone. They're not always like in the classics or textbook sutures. So anyway, those extra bones that you would find are called sutural bones. All right, so we're just going to talk a little bit about how bones get some of their terms. In general, there are 2 major types of surface markings you're going to find in bones, right? So either things can either dip in or they can stick out. So basically a depression is there that's going to allow for either a tendon to pass through, maybe a ligament to pass through, sometimes some nerves to pass through, blood vessels, things like that. So those we consider depressions. And then processes are projections that are basically there for sites of attachment of muscles. Okay, so and basically the larger the process is, the larger the muscle that can attach to it. I'll give you guys a really easy example about this. You've all petted like a dog's head, and you know how they have that kind of like that little bump up here? Well, that bump actually allows for much larger jaw muscles to attach to the tops of their skull. So that's what gives them that really strong bite. Different animals will have even like wolves will have actually like a larger ridge right here, a larger bump, so they have particularly powerful jaws. Okay, but in general, the larger the process, the larger the bone. Oh, here's another great example for you. Probably all have eaten chicken. You know how like right in chicken, there's right in the breast, center of the breast, there's sort of like cartilage kind of thing that sticks out. Well, that's there so you can have those really large breast muscles, those really large flight muscles. Well, if chickens really flew, but so those really large muscles attach to that keel of the sternum. Okay, because if it was flat, you wouldn't have such large muscles being able to attach, right? It's just surface area, I guess. Anyway, so larger the process, larger the attachment point for muscles and stuff, connective tissue. All right. So some of these other terms, a foramen means that it's an opening. Okay, I've probably given you guys the easy way to remember that in lab already. So a foramen will always mean an opening. Okay, it's a hole. A fossa, it's a shallow depression. A sulcus is more of a groove. So a sulcus tends to be longer than just a fossa. A fossa is usually like a little dip. A sulcus is an actual groove. A meatus is reserved for things that are like a tube-like passageway. So you had the meatus in the by the ear, because it's kind of like a tube-like passageway going into your inner ear. A condyle is a large, round protuberance, and basically a condyle you're going to find at a joint. Okay, so for example, you're even seeing this jaw right here. You have this condylar process, right? And basically that condylar process is where your jaw is going to attach into that temporal bone, right? It's where your hinge is, right? So it's condyle. A facet is a smooth, flat, articular surface. So you see facets in the vertebra. A trochanter is a large projection. A tuberosity tends to be a roughened projection. So unlike a condyle that's nice and smooth at a joint, a tuberosity tends to be more bumpy to it. Okay. If you kind of keep these in mind, they'll help you on a practical, particularly when you're trying to remember things' names. So if it's a whole, it's going to be a something foramen. And to me, it makes it a little bit easier, so it's not like you're constantly trying to memorize a whole bunch of different words that make no sense to you. Their bones are pretty descriptive, all right? And I'll try to help you guys with that. So for example, even on this image of the jaw, right, if you remember back to the very beginning, this was our mental region. Well, the hole in the mental region is simply the mental foramen. The hole in the mandible is the mandibular foramen. So things like that will hopefully make memorizing all these different structures a little bit easier for you. All right. So the skull, we have 8 different cranial bones. Those are going to be supporting or protecting, I guess, your brain. They'll also help protect your ear ossicles, so those little inner ear bones. And then obviously they'll provide you different attachments for different muscles, keeping your head up, allowing your head to move around, as well as attachments for your jaw and facial muscles. Then we have different facial bones. So these are there to protect other organs, so your eyes, your nose, right? Your nose, your eyes, as well as your mouth, right? Your sense of taste, right? They're also going to help support the entrances for the digestive system, namely your mouth, as well as your respiratory systems. All right, so I'm going to hide me so you guys can get better views of all the images coming up. So here's a sphenoid bone. So if you look here in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the skull. We've taken a frontal view of frontal section of the sphenoid bone. In the body of the sphenoid bone, you'll notice it's hollow. That's where the sinuses are. You probably did not see those in lab. It has these little wings. It kind of looks like a moth or like a bird or butterfly. So the larger wings are called the greater wings. These smaller ones are simply called the lesser wings. These greater wings will actually extend out to the temples of your head. And then you also have this pterygoid process, and so that's sort of like the bottom part of it. That will make up basically the back part of your nasal passage. Okay. If we take a look at the sphenoid bone from above, this is sort of the view that you got when you were looking at it. So here again are the lesser wings. The greater wings would extend outward. Remember the different little foramen. There's a foramen ovale, the foramen rotundum. That slit right here was that supraorbital fissure. This area right in here, that was a sella turcica, that Turkish saddle, right? That holds your pituitary gland. And there's also going to be the optic foramen. And you really can't see it very well in this image, but we put those sticks through them and they crisscrossed right above that sella turcica, right? So that's going to be opening for the optic nerves coming from your eyes going to your brain. Okay. Moving on to the ethmoid bone. This is kind of a nice image because you can actually see the ethmoid bone and kind of where it sits in the skull. Remember, there are sinuses in the ethmoid bone. You can see that little perpendicular plate right here very well. Here's the middle nasal concha, and then here are the superior nasal concha. Again, when you were looking at these in lab, you would not see the superior nasal concha because you can kind of see they're like past like where that nasal opening is, but they do exist. So perpendicular plate making up that top portion of that nasal septum. Middle nasal concha, And then here you can see that crista galli, right? It's that little crista galli. Basically, that crista galli is going to be important for attaching some of the meninges, the protective layers that cover your brain are going to anchor into that. Those nasal concha, sometimes they're called turbinates, depending on what you're reading. They're going to help filter the air. They're going to help warm the air. They're also going to help moisten the air. So they're very important for that. When you're breathing out through your nose, they do sort of the opposite. They help cool the air and help take some of the moisture out of the air. So when you're in cold weather, right, it's obviously much colder outside of you than inside of you. So when you're breathing out, you have lots of condensation occurring inside your nose. So you've probably had this experience when it's cold out, all of a sudden you're starting to sniffle. Basically, it's because of condensation of water inside your nose. That's what's going on there. Okay. Basically, I'm just trying to show you here, you don't necessarily have to worry about like naming all of these different bones, but you should be aware that the orbit, what your eye is sitting in, right, it's actually made up of quite a few different bones. So you have part of the roof being made up by the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone. The lateral part of the wall is the zygomatic bone as well as the sphenoid bone. And you can kind of read the rest of these, right? So again, lots of different bones kind of coming together right about where your eye is. Okay. So sutures are immovable joints between skull bones. And again, you can kind of ignore these figure numbers. Those are from like an earlier textbook. We're not adhering to a textbook during this class. But basically, so the sutures that we see here, so we have our coronal, or our, sometimes it's called the frontal suture. We'll have a sagittal suture going down the middle. Right, we have a lambdoid suture in the back, and then we have this squamous suture on the side. And in this image down here, in this image down here, you can actually see these sutural bones. So right here, these sort of like purplish bones, those are sutural bones. So again, here we're seeing a sagittal suture and the lambdoid suture, and we have these extra little bones that kind of just formed. That's simply due to genetics. Okay. And hopefully these images will prove to be somewhat helpful for you guys as you're studying for your practical. So you see the different colors, each one represents a different bone. So we talked a little bit about sinuses in lab as well. So you'll see sinuses in the ethmoid bone, sphenoid bone, frontal, and then maxillary bones. I really like this image because it gives you a nice idea of where they're actually located from a frontal view and then from a sagittal view. So you can see here's your maxillary sinus, sphenoid sinus, the little ethmoid sinuses, and the frontal sinuses. Again, I would just remind you that if you've ever had a sinus infection or a head cold, you kind of have a good idea about where these sinuses are located. They all run into one another, and then they basically open into a nasal cavity. Again, one of the reasons why you have so much mucus in your nasal cavity when you're sick. They also act as resonating chambers for your voice, and you know this. You sound very different when you're all stuffed up than when you're not sick. Okay, so they will affect your voice. They will also help lighten your skull. Right, your skull is already pretty heavy. When you think about it, you've all had this experience. Like you're kind of sitting up and you might be dozing off. Which way does your head usually go? Usually goes forward, right? Your head's actually fairly heavy. So anyway, this helps lighten that a little bit. Sinusitis is simply inflammation of your sinuses, right? Sometimes you may even see that in severe allergies. All right. We looked at the skull, the child's skull in lab. So basically, early on, right, you have these what we call soft spots, right? They're called fontanelles. So we have this anterior fontanelle between that frontal bone and the parietal bone. You have an anterolateral fontanelle by that sphenoid bone, posterolateral fontanelle between the temporal and occipital bones, and then there's even a posterior fontanelle. Okay. They are not ossified at birth, but close early in a child's life, It is really important that they are not ossified. It allows the head to take on a different shape as the child is being born. It has to do that in order to make it out the birth canal. Sometimes these are fused prematurely, so in utero they're already fused. In that case, the baby can only be born by C-section. Okay, and here are just some pictures. Do not worry about any of this picture or the next slide. Just some ideas, just to give you an idea of what can happen if there's premature fusion of certain sutures. So here in this individual, you can see has a tall forehead, and then they actually have some flattening of the skull due to premature fusion of that coronal suture. Okay. And then here you can also see this oxycephaly. So again, that coronal suture has fused prematurely. Okay. And here are just some other ones. Again, you don't have to know these. I just want to give you an idea of why it's important. And you can kind of like look these up if you want to see some images of them. All right. So our hyoid bone, right at the base of our tongue, it's a little U-shaped bone. It's the only bone that does not touch another bone in the body. So it actually has no articulations with any other bone in the body. It is simply suspended by ligaments and muscles from the skull, so basically from your mandible. Okay. It supports the tongue, and it provides an attachment for tongue, neck, and pharyngeal, so like your lower throat muscles. Okay, so as you're swallowing, that's going to help you swallow. All right. So as we get into the vertebral column, right, we have 5 different regions. We have cervical vertebra, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. Coccygeal, as we saw in lab, can be anywhere from 3 to 5 bones. So here I just took the average and said 4. Remember, I told you guys in lab how to remember this. Cervical vertebra is 7, thoracic 12, lumbar 5. You have breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 5. Right, so 7, 12, 5 kind of goes in that order. And then I just remember it's 5, 5, 3 to 5. Okay. In between your vertebra, you have vertebral discs. So this is what's going to allow some shock absorption between your discs. When this wears away, you can have bone on bone. It's very painful. It also helps create this intervertebral foramen. This is where you're going to have lots of spinal nerves come out of this foramen. So again, if you compress this, you can imagine how that might pinch down on the nerve, and again, either cause like muscle weakness or some serious pain. Our vertebra curves. It has a natural curve to it, right? So it kind of, see if I can get my pen to work here. Right, so it has this sort of like swish, 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 kind of like that. When you're a little fetus and when you're born, you have sort of a single curve, and think about like how kids are when they're first born. They're always in that fetal position, right? You've heard of that. So we call those curves that we maintain primary curves. All right. So the ones that still bend this way are going to be that thoracic curve, and then the sacral curve, right? So those are considered primary curves. This curve, the cervical one, the one in the neck, only forms once the infant is able to raise its head and hold it up, okay? And then you get this curve in the neck. And then basically same idea, once the infant is old enough to sit up and begin to walk, you start to develop this lumbar curve. Okay, so since they are not there right at birth, we call them secondary curves.